Yeah, just to introduce myself a little bit more, I also run with Fiona Miller and Melissa Ben a website called Local Schools Network, which aims to celebrate the achievements of local schools. I suppose what I'd first like to say is sort of welcome to the Matrix, in a sense that I have just come from school. I'm a little bit shell-shocked. I've been teaching all morning, managed to get here on time, and I suppose the last talk made me reflect on my morning and perhaps what I've been through. How many teachers are actually here? Could you put your hand up if you're a teacher? So there's quite a few. And what is the rest of the makeup of the audience? Is it kind of IT people? How many IT people? Could you put your hands up? A few IT, okay. So I'm roughly getting an idea. Just my reflections on my morning kind of might reveal the nature of the kind of educational matrix that teachers and pupils live in today. I was teaching year 7 at 10 o'clock in the computer room, and we were learning about researching things on the internet and doing Google searches, and they were doing quizzes, actually, a news quiz, and it struck me, one boy put his hand up and he said, "I don't know what impartial means. Tell me what it means." And I thought, has this person used a Google search, define impartial? They hadn't. And in fact, most of the class hadn't. And these were 11-year-olds that had been through, primary education system. So it shows you, perhaps last speaker might have kind of indicated that these children are really computer savvy. My experience is, in a way they are, and in a way they're not. I think that I'm doing this media project with that very class, and they've been writing pieces about the media they use. And many of them, most of the boys in the class play a game called COD, Call of Duty. And they play it maybe 3 or 4 hours a night. And I think this is quite typical of the sorts of students in this country now. So they're sort of immersed in that sort of game, and yet none of them knew how to look up a word on the internet. So I think that gives you a kind of idea of where we're coming from as teachers. And perhaps even though I might have led them through how to do that, I expect many of them will have forgotten by the next time it comes around with a difficult word. That said, IT has really transformed my teaching. The next lesson today, I was teaching year 11, and we're doing a View from Bridge by Arthur Miller. And I was able to call up on YouTube Sidney Lumet's amazing 1962 film of the play, and something I could have never got access to when I first started teaching in 1991. Just not available. It's not available on DVD, and we were able to then compare Lumet's version with another thing on YouTube, an amateur production of the play, where one of the dominant male characters in the play is played by a woman. Alfieri is played by a woman in this school production, and we had an interesting discussion about the presentation of these characters on it. And again, those sorts of opportunities just weren't available, which are now. The following lesson, I was teaching journalism. My kids are doing a kind of newspaper project, and we're going to set up a newsroom. We're going to film them, and they're going to kind of mimic the sort of BBC breakfast style of interviews. We're going to interview some of the teachers, actually, that are leaving, and our dinner lady, who's 85 and has just got an MBE for the longest serving dinner lady in the whole of the world. Those sorts of opportunities, those for representing yourself, just weren't available when I first started teaching in the 1990s. That said, it is a matrix, and perhaps this talk will talk about the nature of the matrix. How many people have seen the film The Matrix? You put your hand up. So everyone, so I'm talking to an audience that knows what I'm talking about. A world which creates its own fictions, in my view. And those fictions are so vividly real that they become reality for teachers like me and for the pupils. And they dominate pupils' lives, and they've started to dominate the public discourse of this country. I think the key question we have to keep coming back to, for me, is what is education for? My ideal is that it should be about what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, a human flourishing, a constant process of learning and creativity and becoming and being something which is creative but constantly questioning about problem solving. We should be producing independent learners, people who are creators, who are motivated, happy, imaginative, and moral. And I suppose the flip side of that is the opposites, in my view, that can happen, and I do see. Anxiety, where there should be flourishing, very dependent learners, managers rather than people who are truly independent, people who are motivated by fear to achieve rather than seeing the intrinsic worth of it, often depressed. I mean, I have to say, and this is my school at the moment, but also many schools I've taught in, I asked my year 7s how many of them were enjoying school, and half said they weren't. And I don't think that was a fault of the teachers or them, but I think it was a reflection that many of them feel incredibly anxious, and I'll talk about that anxiety as we go through this talk. Closed off, kind of not willing to learn, and obedient rather than moral, following rules rather than moral. I'm doing a PhD at Goldsmiths, the greatest university in the world, anyone who's been there will know why. Under Professor Rosalind George, who's supervising my research, and I'm with another very great thinker called Professor Dennis Atkinson, who's written part of this book, Regulatory Discourses in Education. And I think this book, of all the books, nails it for me about what is going on in education. They take what's called a Lacanian approach. Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who was obviously treating people for psychiatric problems, but also theorizing about the way in which language can sort of inhibit and cause dysfunction. What Atkinson has done rather brilliantly is he's brought that kind of way of thinking into education and looked at the way in which these discourses, these ways of talking about league tables, about Ofsted, about various kind of assessments, such like, create a fiction, create the matrix. And this book really shows what's going on, in my view. He looks particularly at teacher training, and he looks at the way in which teachers are trained to think in terms of these discourses and to regulate themselves and to control themselves in a way in which he argues incredibly eloquently creates inequality, creates oppression, and creates unfairness overall. And perhaps I'll take you through a bit of why he thinks that as we go along. He looks particularly, and I think many people are now looking at this, the way in which teacher identity is constructed. I think the classic for me is Ofsted, and I have many people observing me in and out of classrooms all the time, and the key thing you're thinking about is whether you're going to get a 1, a 2, a 3, or heaven forbid, a 4. Which is unsatisfactory. And you feel your whole identity hinges on whether you've got that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. And that's all that matters. And in fact, the rest of no matter what positive comments go in, it's that thing that matters. And often your pay packet depends upon it, because you have one of these really official assessments a year, and if you get a 1, I have got a 1 occasionally, you feel a 1. And if you get a 3, and I have had a 3, you feel a 3 for the rest of the year. It nags at you. And Atkinson, I think, research really looks at how that, why that is the case. The other kind of things that are really about teacher identity is your discipline and control. How quiet are your classes being? How are you getting on? And then your results. So these all go to create the regulatory discourses that control you, that create the matrix that you live in as a teacher. It is about self-esteem, and you gain your self-esteem by meeting these sorts of criteria. I'll tell you a very sad story of a teacher who I know very well, who was judged a 2 in one of his lessons, and he actually caused such stress, it led to him having a heart attack and nearly dying as a result. I mean, that's an extreme example, but I've seen quite a few teachers crying because they've got a 2 instead of a 1. What does this tell us about the way in which we're kind of, the atmosphere we're creating for our education system? I think at the bottom of it is that the assessment tail is wagging the dog. It is dominating everything that goes on in education. And as a result, often you're forgetting kind of an intrinsic reason why we're all here, which for me is eudaimonia. Even, I think, the government are beginning to realise this. I thought the new framework for the National Curriculum Review was really interesting to read. Very interesting document, not at all what I expected. Oates and Dylan William, Tim Oates and Dylan William, and the other expert panel really seemed to unpick some of the key issues for me. And I thought this quote in particular is very important, and I wonder what the government will do to act on it. And I'll read it through because I think it is so important. Constant assessment to levels is itself overburdensome, obscures the genuine strengths and weaknesses in a pupil's attainment, obscures parental understanding of the areas in which they best might support their child's learning, and likewise weakens teachers' clear understanding and identification of pupils' specific weaknesses and misunderstandings. So it's a devastating critique of what our exam system and the sorts of kind of assessment systems we've set up in place in schools is doing for children's learning. And what's fascinating is we've had this massive institutional loss of memory. There've been a lot of reports that have come out that have really unpicked what we need to do and what we need to do to achieve. I thought this comparison was absolutely fascinating. National Oracy Project in 1987, this was written, over 20 years ago now, 25 years ago, and in it they said, the writers said, although teachers believe they give prominence to discussion, observational research does not support this. Pupils may have plenty of opportunities for talk, but teachers are often unsure of what and how to teach speaking listening skills. And for me, speaking listening skills is the heart of learning. It's how we learn as a species. I think the thinker Vygotsky really shows quite clearly, it's what he calls the zone of proximal development, quite clearly, that when children are speaking with their adults, when they're speaking with other children, they begin to learn. And that's the heart of it. And we need to structure our system around group work, around child-centered learning, to really improve levels of attainment. This is something I think the new national curriculum is saying very strongly. If you look, they devote a whole chapter, just published in December 2011, that the high-performing jurisdictions, they have speaking listening skills at the very heart of them. Be very interesting to see what Gove does with it. Will it kick this into the long grass in the same way that the National Oracy Project was kicked into the long grass back in 1987 by Thatcher's government? Will this new Tory regime kick the essential issue, which is about child-centered learning, into the long grass? Plowden, for me, is still relevant. Plowden in 1967, the Plowden report said that at the heart of the educational process lies the child. Absolutely central is that child-centered learning is what we're after. And they advocated many other things that are very kind of prescient today: extended schools, targeting deprived schools, skepticism about tests and assessment, maximum size of primary school classes to be reassessed. So that's worth going back to as well. National strategies, again, have we learned all we needed to know from them? There was a deprofessionalization of the teachers with these strategies. It was too much top-heavy stuff going on, but the cross-curricular approach was beginning to work, and it was beginning to, the focus on language and language skills was absolutely crucial. It was the thing which it helps children learn, getting them talking, and all children were affected. It was an equal program. And I felt that at its root was a notion of equality of opportunity. And I think we need to sort of revisit that rather than just junking all the lessons from it. It costs billions of pounds to do, and it dominated my life as a teacher for 10 years, and yet it's just gone. It's vanished. So one wonders, what they're going to do from the lessons of that particular program. For me, this central issue of identity is really important. A wonderful researcher, Chris Carney at Goldsmiths, who wrote a great book called The Monkey's Mask, looks at the way in which education is all about language, back to the national strategies, all about the sorts of discourses that you adopt as a pupil, as a teacher, and that it's also interwoven with that is you're gaining a sense of who you are, what person you want to be, your identity. And he really makes an interesting point that it's the education systems that allow pupils and teachers to negotiate multiple identities, to have a kind of sense of the richness of life, the complexity of life. That's when you get true learning taking place. It's what we call a social constructivist vision of knowledge. It's not saying that there's some kind of objective body of knowledge out there to be kind of imbibed, but it's one where that we co-create together as a kind of communal species with a common shared language. And it's really all about experiential learning. It's about much more awareness of the emotions and how we feel as we learn, and developing that. Embracing reader response theory, I think in English is particularly important, for example. Taking children and helping them think about how they're personally responding to text. And that's true also in history, in science. We need to make a system which is much more sort of focused on individual identity and getting people to reflect on who they are and where they want to be. Much more emphasis on experiential learning and personal response. I'm wary of terminology. We have a system at the moment that's dominated. In English, we have that. I spend a lot of my time teaching what alliteration is, onomatopoeia, and the worry is it's kind of coming out in an essay, but have they really experienced the text as a living, breathing text that creates emotions, meant to create emotions in the reader? Have they really felt it? And that we need to go back and have these kind of core values at the heart of our curriculum. Think about what they are, again, what education is for. It is about embracing new discourses. If we're going to break this, escape the matrix, I think we should be questioning constantly discourses which reinforce inequality, that create false hierarchies. My huge worry is that if you look really carefully at many of the tests we're delivering and that many of the pupils feel that their whole identity hinges on, in GCSE, in A-level, in the 11+, in IQ tests, they're actually not testing intelligence, deep intelligence at all. We need to go back and look at people like Howard Gardner and the 7 kind of different intelligences. We need to go back and look at, emotional intelligence. All these sorts of discourses that are floating around and there to be explored I feel being pushed aside in a kind of drive for a very narrow, dogmatic, rigid curriculum. And I do think we need to think of the teacher as an equal partner, sharing, promoting, stimulating knowledge, not imposing it, particularly in this IT age that we have. So back to the matrix. We need to create a system where everyone feels they are the creator of their own matrix, that they have some kind of active part in shaping the world they want, rather than feeling they're trapped in a kind of nightmarish computer program which they need to escape from. And that's all I've got to say. Thanks. Primary education system. So it shows you, perhaps last speaker might have kind of indicated that these children are really computer savvy. My experience is, in a way they are, and in a way they're not. I think that I'm doing this media project with that very class, and they've been writing pieces about the media they use. And many of them, most of the boys in the class, I suppose what I'd first like to say is sort of welcome to the matrix, in a sense that I have just come from school. I'm a little bit shell-shocked. I've been teaching all morning, managed to get here on time, and I suppose the last talk made me reflect on my morning and perhaps what I've been through. How many teachers are actually here? Could you put your hand up if you're a teacher? So there's quite a few. And how many about researching things on the internet and doing Google searches, and they were doing quizzes actually, a news quiz, and it struck me, one boy put his hand up and he said, "I don't know what impartial means, tell me what it means." And I thought, has this person used a Google search, define impartial? They hadn't, and in fact most of the class hadn't, and these were 11-year-olds that had been through Thank you. Yeah, just to introduce myself a little bit more, I also run with Fiona Miller and Melissa Ben a website called Local Schools Network, which aims to celebrate the achievements of local schools. What is the rest of the makeup of the audience? Is it kind of IT people? How many IT people? Could you put your hands up? A few IT, okay. So I'm roughly getting an idea. Just my reflections on my morning kind of might reveal the nature of the kind of educational matrix that teachers and pupils live in today. I was teaching Year 7 at 10 o'clock in the computer room, and we were learning